welcome back to day 77 of our chess journey to 1500 ELO on chess.com. As you might be able to tell here, I've currently changed locations. I've been here for a couple of days and just started to settle in. I'm still sleeping on the floor, however, as IKEA's got a few days delivery time for beds. But apart from that, this place has been awesome so far. Anyways, let's jump on ahead into our game today. I won't be using my mouse today because the laptop I brought with me does not have enough HDMI inputs. So I have one for the microphone and one for the camera, and then there is no more. Anyways, let's find an opponent here. We get Una from Chile, and we'll play a Sicilian. We get the McDonald attack, which I cannot quite remember how to play against. I reckon knight to b6 probably works. This is quite an aggressive opening rather, and I think it could transpose into... Now I can't quite remember what the name of the opening is, but there is this closed Sicilian Grand Prix attack. That's what the name is, but apparently this is still called the McDonald attack. Now what do we do here? We could bring this knight out, but then our opponent can push this pawn. So I'm somewhat inclined towards playing d6 here to open up our bishop, and also allow us to bring our knight out. Alternatively, we could play for a setup where we push e6 and put our knight on e7 here. Then we might be likely to fianchetto, and this will control this square with the knight and the pawn, and then we can open up this diagonal. I think I'd like to try out this setup, so let's go for it. I can't quite remember the name of it. I know, or rather I'm pretty sure this is the setup that Daniel Naroditsky has been talking about a lot in his speedruns as a good resource against some anti-Sicilians. We get d3 here. Let's bring our knight out and see where we go from here. I'm honestly somewhat happy this pawn did not come up to d4. I don't know whether I should be happy about it or not. It doesn't quite open up the position here yet, and our opponent does not have as much space. The bishop comes up. Now I think we might just play g6. Our opponent will castle, and I suspect they will play for f5 at some point. But playing g6 here is going to put quite a clamp with two pawns and a knight on the f5 square, so it's going to be a bit difficult to play for the pawn push. Let's come up and we'll move towards an eventual kingside castle. I'm realizing here our opponent is highly rated today, so if we win we get 11 points, and if we lose we only lose 5 points. The knight comes out here. Our opponent delays castling. I think we'll just come up with the bishop here. Then this pawn can't quite move, although I won't expect it to. I think we'll just bring our bishop out. Well, our opponent could play rook to b1 and then put the bishop on b2, intending to trade. I'm a bit curious as to what they do. They could blunt our bishop as well, playing c3 here, connect two pawns, so our bishop doesn't do a whole lot, as of yet at least. We could still see castles, but we do see c3 here. It doesn't open up a whole lot of threats for us at least, but it does prevent our opponent. from trying to trade bishops immediately. Now we can't jump in with this knight now, but what else could we do? Well, we could seek to find a developing square for our c8 bishop, potentially through playing d6 here and putting it on d7, or maybe playing b6 or b5 here and coming out on this diagonal, maybe grabbing a long diagonal here as well from a8 up to h1. But first I think I'd prefer castling, or so I'd like to say. Is there an argument against doing so? My thought process here is, if we castle, our opponent playing this kind of an aggressive Sicilian, or anti-Sicilian rather, with f4, might intend to immediately advance. So we could delay our plans with the king and rather delay showing our cards here by developing here instead, and then try to have our opponent show their cards first. I don't quite want to play b5 here because of this pawn push, and then this pawn here would be hanging, but let's try to calculate this first. If we do grab more space here, then playing b6. I'm realizing quickly here I can't draw arrows now without the mouse, so I might try to find an alternative here to be able to do so, because I think the visualization helps me a lot and it helps the viewers follow my thought process. But basically my thought process here is, if we go up with a pawn to b5 and our opponent pushes d4, now what could we do here? If we take, our opponent could take here, but then we can take their pawn on c3, and this looks okay for us. So I think if we do push up here and they go here, if we take, I think they have to take first, and then we take another pawn with our knight perhaps, and then I think we are in a decent spot. So let's come up with a pawn here, and I'm hoping I didn't quite miss anything. This doesn't have to be a good move either, grabbing more space. Just feels a bit more natural in a sense, because we get our queen out here if we need to, and we can push up here and maybe play for c4 at some point, although I'm not quite sure. Connecting the pawns here might have been good, but we'll see in the game review afterwards. So our opponent is thinking here. They might not have expected our move. Now if we do decide, or our opponent decides to play to d4 rather, they don't, but I would have had to calculate if we played c4. But then I think our opponent's center might have been a bit too strong, so it wouldn't look ideal for us, I think at least. Now do we have queen to b6 here, setting up discoveries against the king along this dark squared diagonal? We might have this, but still now the king has committed here, and I like to castle ourselves too first, so we get our king out of the center. Our opponent does not really have h4 anymore, I believe, which was my primary concern here with castling previously, when they could have maybe built an attack behind this h-pawn. Now our opponent is thinking again. Which moves are available here? A good thing now is, if we ever battle for the d4 square and our opponent pushes to d4 to hit this pawn, we always have checking options against the king. which makes this quite a bit more enjoyable for us, I think. Our opponent is playing quite aggressively with the pawns here. We might have to find a way of breaking out at some point. The rook moves here. Okay, rook to e1. This seems a bit counterintuitive to me, because this pawn here can't quite come forwards and create a whole lot of threats. So the other idea might be playing this knight back here and remaneuvering the knight over to g3 or to e3. Maybe moving the knight here to open up options to trade our bishop perhaps. I'm not quite sure. I guess we might see. First of all, I'd like to get our bishop out. Does this seem okay? I think it does. I didn't want to place it on a6 at least. Speaking of the a6 square, I think we might want to move our pawn up at some point to defend our weak pawn here. Now the knight does come back as expected. And let's see what we can do here. At some point I'm realizing there might be an argument for playing b4 for us even. So we might not have to play a6. If we push our pawn, if they take and we take, then we have our bishop opened up a bit more. And we could come up to this square at some point as well. Although currently I'm seeing another idea, namely playing d5. Let's have a look at d5. If we push the pawn to d5, our opponent might intend to meet the move with e5 here. Then we could play f6, and I think this looks quite okay. I can't draw any arrows here, unfortunately, but I think it looks promising. So let's come up with this pawn here and try to break stuff open. However, we do have to be sure here, or make a note to ourselves. If we take the pawn and they take with theirs, this pawn on b5 rather becomes a bit weak. Now we could open up. Does this favor us? I think this tension might be ideal to keep for the time being, namely because I think playing b4 first seems to be better, simply because this b5 pawn does not hang to this bishop on e2 at the end of the line after takes here. So let's come up with a pawn. If they take, I think we have a couple of options really. Taking with the pawn probably works, although taking with the knight might be good as well. And now if they do take here on b4, I think we might be able to play d takes e4. They don't. And now what do we play? If we take here, they have to take with the pawn. And this pawn might become a bit loose. If we take on e4, the knight could take. Doesn't seem ideal to me. So how about takes, and we might apply more pressure with our queen, for example, against this pawn on c3. I think I like this idea a whole lot. So let's come up like this. The pawn takes. And now, as I mentioned, we could come up to a5 with our queen. And then I think a logical response by our opponent, or rather the only move defending the pawn, would be bishop up here to b2. Then the rooks would be connected. We can't quite apply further pressure to this pawn. So do we have options now? Let's have a quick look. If we take and they take, could we move our knight, for example? Do we have d4? Then they can push their pawn and our bishop might be a bit weak. So maybe, just maybe, I'm thinking here we could have queen to b6 again and look to play c4 with a discovery. But that's easily parable though. Our opponent should have plans or ideas there to counter our discovery, so I don't quite think I'd like to go for it. So instead I think let's come up with our queen. What happens if they push their pawn here? Then we take their queen, trade, and take the rook. So I think this looks okay, applying pressure, but our opponent finds a great move here, e5. However, do we have f6 here? I think we do. I think f6 seems like a good move, opening up the scope against this pawn. Let's play it and see what our opponent does in response. I'm feeling a bit limited here, is a word I'd use, considering I can't quite use the arrows. The rook comes up to threaten our bishop. Now do we come back? Do we defend it? Or do we come up here? It's a bit difficult to evaluate here. There might be an argument for playing rook a to b8. Maybe even rook f to b8. I think in the interest of saving time, we'll just defend by moving our bishop out of the way, and then we'll look to take the pawn afterwards. The reason I went here instead of defending, for example, is I wanted to keep our bishop in the game, defending the infiltration and not allowing our opponent to have a lingering pressure against us. Let's take the pawn here. They could take with the knight or the pawn. The rook can't take. The knight does take. Now I think if knight takes and pawn takes, our scope here looks pretty good. And then we can maybe double rooks and we might be having a pretty comfortable position. But however, do we have to take this knight? If it jumps in here, it's not really threatening anything. Looks more like it would trap itself. My idea here is hitting this knight by going rook to f5. But is that good? Then our opponent moves out and we get hit on this e6 pawn, which is a backwards pawn. So instead I think I'd like to trade. So we do not have the target here. Instead our opponent will be the one with the open file against them. Now let's have a look here. I think I like rook to c6, hitting this pawn and hitting a potential pawn push to d4 as well, trying to defend the pawn. We are still applying pressure with our queen here onto those pawns. So I think more pressure looks quite decent here. And once again rather, I haven't really mentioned this, but if this pawn pushes, the scope does open up between those bishops here. Which we will have to take into note. We'll have to take a note of it. We still can't check along this diagonal towards the king, but we could do so at some point. Let's see. If we take, I think we have to take the bishop first, so our queen doesn't get dislodged from any, or would it get, I don't quite think it would get dislodged, to be honest. Still, I am taking here. It was a bit difficult to evaluate the difference, but this seems okay to me. Now if rook takes, we take here, they take, we take the queen, they take, and we get a pawn, and this pawn will be weak at the end of the line. So I'm hoping this works as I hope it is, which is a weird sense in the sentence. That didn't make a lot of sense, but I'm hoping there is no important move that I missed here, rather. C takes d4 doesn't quite work, as I mentioned, because we take the queen, they take, and we take with our knight. At least that looks good to me. So let's go for it. This pawn is an incredible weakness to have a target on. So this looks quite optimistic. We get knight takes, which I didn't quite expect, to be honest, but I don't quite mind it either. I think we still take the pawn here, and we are looking good to go. We'll have a protected post pawn, namely d5, and our own pawn can't easily be targeted because of our opponent's pawn. Now the bishop comes in here. I'd like to come back with our knight, maybe to c6. We can't quite jump in. Going here doesn't work. So let's come back and hit the pawn. We'll need a home for our a8 rook here. The pawn gets defended, but now we could maybe even play. Can we play rook to f5? What happens if knight to h4 is played? And I think we could play rook to f4, hitting the knight, and we get in a good way. Oh no, it's defended 3 times, so it doesn't do a whole lot here. Trying to hit the pawn, so maybe we'll just let our opponent's pieces be tied down to the pawn. And then instead we can move our pieces here, grabbing this open file, maybe doubling up here and infiltrating. We can't quite come in on the f-file because the knight is defended by a pawn here. So we would have to sack and exchange to get in there with the rooks. So let's see what can get done here. I'm looking at different bishop moves here for our opponent. But then I think we just take and maybe play our other rook over and trade off the rooks, as long as we don't drop our a pawn here. The bishop is defended. We could just come up here with the rook and try to double, as I mentioned. This looks quite good. And then we apply pressure on the bishop. Let's go here, defending our knight. Then the bishop could come up, but then we take the rook first with a check, which seems to be good. I was afraid of bishop here, but we take the rook, and then we take the bishop. Now we get to double up for free. The bishop's going to move probably, and then we'll just come in and infiltrate. Our opponent probably wants to plant the bishop here, which is a good outpost. We are running out of time, so let's come down here and trade off material. Now let's say the rook here comes back to e1. Then we take, they take, and then we can grab this pawn. So I'm curious to see what our opponent does here to dodge our threats. They play this move, which is good. I think I'd like to come up here with our pawn, so it doesn't hang to our opponent's bishop in certain lines. Now the bishop does plant itself here, but then we can come in with our rook and threaten to capture. If we take, they can't take because they are pinned. Then they could take this rook, but then we could take the pawn, for example. This is quite complicated, but I think it's a decent position for us. I think we are in the driver's seat. Our knight is a bit loose. Okay, so the king moves up. But now I think we have an interesting tactic. King takes and we get a fork. We hit the pawn rather, and the king. And we should win another pawn. And then we'll be playing with an outside passed pawn. The knight jumps in. This pawn is threatened. So maybe we can jump in here with our knight to defend it. The alternative would be back to d8, which is not quite ideal. So let's come up here, defending our pawn. And then we'll see what our opponent does. They could hit our knight, I guess. And then we defend it with the rook. Our king can't quite move here. It's a bit immobilized. So we have to be wary of back rank threats, making a note to myself. Under time pressure here. Let's say rook over to c1. That could be a checkmate threat. Rook to b1 is played. And now I think we play h6. Getting off the back rank, hitting the knight here. And this looks decent to me. Now if the rook comes back, we come up to h7. Or we don't come up to h7. Yeah, yeah. The knight controls this square. We have to play this and give up our bishop. Now this is honestly horrible for us, but we'll try to find a way out of it. There might still be hope considering our previously decent position. We could try to play with an a-pawn here, which is looking quite strong. If we come back with the rook, the king is forced to f2. Our knight can be targeted. Rook to f7 could be played. Then we have to come back. And then what? I guess we'll have to see what happens as our opponent plays the moves. It's unfortunate we lost our bishop, but still I think we do have some chances here. We might, I think, be able to force our opponent to give up a piece for a pawn if we play this correctly, and if they simultaneously play this incorrectly. We get this. Here I think we can come into this square. Discombobulating our opponent's pieces a bit. The rook can't come up here now. The knight is defended. And this knight is not doing a whole lot. Did we have rook up there? We didn't. Let's push our pawn here. The rook could be pushed. This knight can't go this way, as it will get taken. Can't go here, can't go here, can't go here. So currently at least our opponent does not have a lot of threats with the knight. I think our most immediate threat here is probably going to be pushing this pawn a few squares rather. Just coming up the board. This doesn't do a whole lot. At least I don't think so. It doesn't disallow us from pushing, at least. Now it does give our opponent control of this square, but I don't think that's all that bad for us. I think this looks quite promising, actually. I would like to have our rook behind our pawn, but that's difficult to do in this position. We get checked. I guess we have to come back. Can't go there or there because of the pawn and the bishop. Now what happens if rook to e7 is played? Then we might have to backpedal with our own knight to defend our e6 pawn. But our opponent comes in behind our pawn. Our king is cut off as well here. This is a bad position. We can't push. I guess we can come up and give a check. The king will move up. We can't push our pawn here. We can't push our pawn here. This is not ideal, to be honest. I'm not seeing a plethora of options for us. But still, we'll see what we can get done here. If the knight moves, we can play d4. It doesn't though. We can't go here. Maybe this is playable. No, it's not. We had 1 second left though, so I didn't see a better option. I didn't realize bishop takes hits the rook. But then maybe we could play rook to a2 and then push our pawn. That might be playable. I guess we will see. At least we do have 2 simultaneous threats here. This is a good move. Let's come up with the rook first. King dodges us. I think we have to take. Let's push the pawn, I think. And then we lose it. Oh, we ran out of time. That's unfortunate. It wasn't a good position. But we might have been able to play from this point on. I was not quick enough without a mouse here at the end. But our opponent still outplayed us. So they deserved the win. Thanks for the game. Well played to our opponent. Let's have a look at the game review. So today we played with 72.8 and our opponent played with 76.3. Let's start our review. We had this. Let's have a look. I'm seeing here that my laptop does not have the analysis bar. So I think I have to come in here, or the evaluation bar, I guess it's called. And now we have our tools available. This was all good. And this was a bit too weakening. B6 was better. Still, we had a lot of good moves. This was not that good. Let's jump on into the analysis and have a look. I guess we just, we don't have to deal with this apparently and play on the queen side, arguing that this king side is closed up. Although the difference is not that big in the evaluation. Here, d4 was best. Okay. I guess at the end of the line, opening up the position favors our opponent slightly here. In this position, bishop to a6 was best. Or, yeah, it was apparently best, but f takes e5 was good as well. Why was this good? If they take our piece, we have this. And if the knight moves, let's say the knight goes here. And then we take this third pawn with a skewer. That's a great tactic I didn't quite spot. I think I might have been able to spot it if I was able to use arrows, though I can't quite visualize this well without them. Well, we played this, which was good for us. Let's go back to this kind of review here. We jumped in, all good for us. This was great, we were in a fantastic position. This aggressive knight jump was apparently best. I guess this is just more aggressive. I can't quite tell why this is so good, it just looks like our knight becomes a target here. We went back though, hitting the pawn. Doubling up here. And at this point we had honestly lost most of our advantage. I guess the computer favored our previous configuration of pieces. We took here. Takes on e1 here was apparently best. Simplifying here, I think this looked more logical. But here our opponent had this move. Why can't we just... I guess all our squares are horrible here. Let's say we go here, then this is played. What happens if we go here, then this is mate. I didn't see this mate pattern, our opponent didn't either. We jumped in. This was horrible, absolutely horrible. Our best move here was coming back with the knight, which controls the b8 square, so our king can't get checked. Instead, we lost our bishop, but still the position was quite equal. This check was good. Let's see what happens if they go here. And then we take the pawn with a check. And if they come here, then I guess, is this a perpetual or something? Rook to f2. We threaten a lot of stuff. Well, this wasn't played. We went here, got into a losing position. Here, rook to a2 check was good. Instead, I blundered this, and here we ran out of time. Well, that's an unfortunate loss today. Our opponent was quite strong though. We only lost 5 points, so that's at least a redeeming point here. I will try to find a way here of dealing with our HDMI limitation, but I don't quite know what I should do ideally here, as we only have 2 HDMI ports and the camera is taking one and the microphone is taking up the other one. A wireless mouse still requires us to plug in an HDMI port. So yeah, I'll try to think about it. I don't quite know what to do just yet, but I will see as we go on here. Anyways, guys, thanks to our opponent today for a great game. Thanks for watching to the end of the video. This has been our game for today, and I hope to see you all tomorrow. Bye bye.